Hey everyone!
It's Macky and Alexa, and we're back for another What We Read, and this time it's all about the books.
It's gonna be books. It's gonna be books.
Not that there's
sure.
anything wrong with us having an entire one about manga and comics, because that's a big part of our lives too, but today we are all about the book. So I'm gonna kick things off by talking about a few things that I read, and then Macky will take over, and then it'll be back to me. So first is You'd Be Mine by Erin Han. This is a YA contemporary that follows two perspectives. There is Clay, who is like a country rock superstar, but when his bad boy behavior gets a little bit too much and he's getting hounded by the tabloids, his management company tells him that he has to recruit Annie, who happens to be the daughter of two very famous former country music stars who passed away. And so he recruits Annie to be a part of his tour along with her band, and things happen. What I really liked about this book is that it has the fun aspects of that kind of story where it's a summer tour, they're all on the road together, they're experiencing nights in different cities and doing all sorts of things, and it's fun in that regard. And I love the music aspect of it because it's just so great. Even though I'm not particularly like a big country music fan, like it was still fun to sort of see that play out. And on the other hand, there is also all of the really tough stuff that both Clay and Annie are dealing with. Clay is angry and grieving because his brother has passed away and he is left on his own. He's literally the only one left. There's Annie, who's dealing with the fallout of her parents' death, and her heart is still torn between trying to pursue the same sort of career that her parents had, which eventually led to the position they were in, or, you know, shying away from that. So to watch these two work out their own separate things and then to also encounter each other and realize that they have like these sparks flying between them, which complicates things, and they both realize that. It's really interesting and compelling, and it read really fast. I would definitely recommend checking this one out if you are into stories about music and going on tours, concert tours, and you also like your YA contemporary with a dash of like very difficult things that they're dealing with. Plus the secondary characters in this one are so great as well. Like I really enjoyed them and would happily read a little bit more about them, so that was really fun too. So the next book that I read is a YA fantasy, and it is called Descendant of the Crane. It is mainly about Princess Hesina, who has ascended to the throne after her father dies. Her first act as the new ruler is to open up an investigation into her father's death because she believes it was a murder. In this world, you're allowed to choose like an advocate for yourself, and she ends up choosing someone named Akira, who was prophesied by someone to be like the advocate that she needed. And in this world, magic is frowned upon. It's not a thing that people are like, they don't like it. And so Hesina has to contend with all of this investigation going into her father's murder, also while trying to simultaneously figure out how to prevent her country from erupting into a full-blown like coup slash war slash revolution, because there's a lot going on in there. The setup for this one sounds like it would have been so good, but unfortunately it fell a little short for me. I think for me it was just a total lack of development when it came to the characters and when it came to the setting, I guess. Like, it was a solid storytelling style and the plot unfolds pretty well. Like, it's fine. Like, a lot of things happen, and even though some of the things are things that you can probably guess at from the start, like, it's still interesting. But the characters for me, like, I just never felt really sympathetic towards any of them, and I think that's always the downfall of any young adult novel for me. If I don't feel sympathetic to at least one character, it gets a little harder for me to, like, want to know what happens next and to want to figure out what happens next. I like that in this world that there is this very unique setup where the kingdom has come to fruition after this group of, I believe it's 11 individuals. They teamed up together and they took over from the previous like ruler. And that part of it was interesting, and the things that that leads to is also very interesting. But yeah, overall, ultimately, this one disappointed me, which is really sad. I really had high hopes for it, and it just was not my cup of tea. So we're gonna move on now. So the next book that I'm going to talk about is 99% Mine by Sally Thorne. Overall, I will tell you, I did not like this book. This book is about Darcy and Tom. Darcy is sort of a free spirit, and she's loved to travel. She kind of like just has that in her blood, but she is currently stuck in her small town because her grandmother has bequeathed her house to Darcy and her twin brother Jamie, and they're supposed to like fix it up so that they can sell it. She's stuck in this town. She's gonna stay there and oversee all of that because she can't find her passport. Anyway, the construction on the house is going to be done by her brother's best friend, Tom, who has been a constant fixture in their lives since they were little, and Darcy kind of has feelings for Tom, and it's fairly obvious from the start, and that's where this plays out. Let me also say this first. I was not the biggest fan of the hating game. Like, I liked it fine. I just don't love it the way other people do. I was optimistic about 99% Mine because it seemed like people who didn't particularly love the hating game were a little bit more into this one. And I also just really love the trope where it's the brother's best friend. That's always been a thing for me in any story I read, so I was really looking forward to it. I hate to say it, but this one I actually like less than the hating game, and that's saying a lot. My main problem with it was really the fact that I just did not even root for Darcy and Tom to actually be together. And because this is a romance, that's kind of what you want to happen, and just for me, it never clicked, it never worked. Like, I was being told that they had these feelings for each other, and yeah, there were definitely moments where like you could sort of see the spark between them, but ultimately, like, I just did not have any,
so not
like,
personally
investment.
shippable.
Yeah, I didn't have any investment in the outcome of their relationship.
Yeah.
I also just found, like, Tom is great. Like, I like Tom as a character a lot, and he would have been my type, but I was also just too focused on the fact that I did not particularly get on with Darcy. Darcy is a very difficult character for me to like because, like, just first of all, the certain way that she was described in the book, sometimes it would just rub on my nerves a little because they use the same descriptions over and over. But also, like, she was just very frustrating as a human being. Like, there were just certain things that she did or said that seemed particularly irresponsible to me and not well thought out. And while I get that that's a very normal, real thing, like, for some reason, like, it felt a little extreme in this story, and I think that was where the crux of my problem with Darcy lay. I also was kind of annoyed that there wasn't really any presence from her twin brother Jamie. I think that would have actually added an extra element that made this story stronger. I have talked about this book to so many people and said this over and over again, but, like, it was so sad to me that this disappointed me so much because I wanted to like it. And the fact of the matter is, I thought the epilogues were better than the actual book. The epilogue for this one and the epilogue for the hating game, so I don't know what that says about this book, but personally, I was not a fan. I know there are some people who have actually loved it, which is great, I'm glad. But personally for me, it was just very disappointing. I will ultimately probably never read another Sally Thorne book because the two I've read, not great. And now for some joy in your life after all of the downers that I just put in there.
Right, so thanks.
Joy in my life.
So after Little Miss Sunshine's reviews, let's go into some Leigh Bardugo. Yay! That's right, I have totally binged the entire Grishaverse series with the exception of Language of Thorns. I want to start this particular review. This is part one, I guess, of the Bardugo binge report, and it is the Shadow and Bone trilogy. So you've got these beautiful, beautiful paperbacks that I didn't read because, you know, I don't want to ruin them. You've got Shadow and Bone, which is book one. You've got Siege and Storm, which is book two. And then you have Ruin and Rising, which is book 3. It is set in a fictional world that is semi-steampunky, semi-medieval-esque, but on the brink of an industrial revolution because
kind of, yes.
There's, you know, kind of like technology and stuff like that. However, in this fictional universe, there are a particular subset of humans who have the capacity to control the forces of nature along the lines of the physical body, the force, elements, and even what was the other one? Oh, and actual, apart from like the actual elements, earth, air, fire, water, the weather, all of that stuff. They also have like man-made actual, chemicals and elements and stuff like that. The only thing you need to worth mentioning is you've got these special, folks who are tested at a young age, and then of course they are drafted in the armies. Of course, the different nations of the world think very differently about them. Some nations kill them on sight. Some of them sort of like want to experiment on them. Ravka, on the other hand, which is where our story takes place, drafts them into the army because for whatever reason in this day and age there is something called the Fold, and it is this giant dark cloud of just terrible nothingness where monsters live and whatever, and it has sort of been like a thorn in everybody's side. Ravka has, the Fold happens to sit on Ravka in one of their borders, and they're at war with all of their kind of neighbors, and in this day and age, a young girl named Alina Starkov is discovered to have some kind of capacity to, who after years of not being, they're called Grisha, by the way, these individuals with special powers, Alina is discovered to have some kind of ability that will not just, change, the way they deal with the Fold, but might even be the key to, bringing Ravka to a totally new, era of peace and what have you. I dove headfirst into the series, and I personally think it's one of the most well-written, young adult series ever, pretty much. I want to rename Leigh Bardugo to Sancta Lee Bardugo of the Slow Burn. I've never shipped characters like this, or with this kind of intensity. I like how neatly the story of Alina ties together from 1 to 3. I'm not, like, the world isn't the most complicated kind of nitty-gritty kind of thing, but it's so well written enough that you're able to really set up some very key plot points that are tied to Alina's powers. And so I like it. It's absolutely great. It's a fresh take. She is a character like no other that we've seen. She's very strong. She's very outspoken, I want to say.
Yeah. Oh yeah. She is not afraid to share.
And the side characters are so rich. They're very, very rich in dimension and what have you, to the point where you almost kind of wish that you could have more stories about them. And guess what? You do get that. So definitely setting a gold standard for, you know, both YA fantasy and slow burn romances and slow burn YA fantasy romances. It's this whole beautiful thing, and I highly recommend anybody who wants to just sort of dip their toes into YA, because that's me. I barely read kind of these things, but this kind of gave me a hankering for more. I'm suddenly hungry for these types of for this kind of story and this kind of storytelling. Lastly, I love how Alina's entire story, and even every single book, begins and ends with a kind of a third-person view, and then it becomes a first-person view in between, and then it ends with a third-person view where it's almost like the boy and the girl. It's just very poetic, very beautiful, and it's almost kind of like a modern kind of fairy tale, the way Lee kind of wraps it all up. So highly recommend, super fun, and I will probably reread these. Every so often. So
okay, important questions though. Which is your favorite book in that trilogy?
Oh, excellent question. I'm late to the party. I would have to say,
of those 3,
interestingly enough, it'll have to be the second one. I think it'll have to be the second one, because
biased.
The second one,
clearly biased.
Well, not for the reasons you like it, but I particularly like the second one because that's when it really picks up its stride. Yeah. That's when you're really kind of in the thick of it. That's when characters really develop, because basically everything is set up in the second book. If you treat these 3 books as just one giant uber novel, this is where all of the progressive complications come to a head, and Alina has to make a decision. And when she does, it all just is downhill from there, and it is terrible. It's tragic. I did not feel great all throughout this entire story.
I mean, I don't think you're supposed
to. But
it
was very... No, you're not. But it wrapped up very, very well for me personally, and I thought, my goodness, how beautiful that you can send these characters off to the place that you're supposed to send them, and have everybody else sort of pick up the slack and maybe even get revisited. But that's spoilery, and I will talk about that eventually without spoilers.
Well, last set of questions. Who's your favorite female character, and who's your favorite male character?
Ooh, boy. I studied just the Grisha, the first Grisha trilogy alone, meaning if I didn't know that there were any other characters.
You're only
so assuming the only books I ever read were just Alina's, I would have to go with...
This is a burning question, guys.
Shoot, that is a burning question.
The females is hard, actually.
Yeah, because there's so many important female characters in here. I actually don't mind Alina. I actually like her. Like, I rarely like main characters. It's always the side characters that I kind of fall in love with, but I do like Alina. Genya is another character that I think is so complex, with special props to there's an old teacher in here that I really she's acerbic, she's terrible as a human being, but she's an amazing teacher. Everybody hates her, but then she's super good. I love her too. So those are my top 3 female characters. Yeah.
And then male.
Oh boy, male characters. There is
not subtle at all.
Well, my top male character will have to
There's a lot of good ones, though. I'll say
will
that.
have to be. There's a privateer named Stormhound.
Who is the best?
Who is the best? Mal would be a character that I also kind of very much appreciate. Like, I love this boy. He's just the most unassuming thing ever. I know a lot of people had beef with him during his
exploratory teen years when he had a lot of emotions and
angsty kind of. And I'm just like, I get it. I get what. Like, who didn't have a friend who went through something like that. Special props to Stormhound's right and left hand man and woman. So
yes.
Tolia and Tamar, I think.
Best.
Love those guys. So love that crew. Super cool. And yeah, definitely those are my favorites.
Back to me.
Haha.
So the next book I'm going to talk about
always comes around. Sorry.
Back to you. The next book that I'm going to talk about is called Passion on Park Avenue, which is part of the Central Park Pack series by Lauren Lane. It is her new adult romance contemporary fiction series. It has a very similar premise to the movie The Other Woman, if you've seen that, with Cameron Diaz in it. It essentially involves these three women who meet in Central Park on the day of the funeral of the guy they all happened to be in relationships with and did not know that the other people were also involved with him. And they make this pact that they're gonna, like, you know, be friends and help each other look out for all these kind of jerks and douchebags that would do that. The first story focuses on Naomi Powell. She has come very far from her childhood to become like the very well-to-do CEO of this jewelry business. And the entire story centers around her moving into the very prestigious sort of apartment building on the Upper East Side that her mom and her lived in when her mom was a housekeeper for one of the families in that house. And they actually had a very bad experience with that family, and it resulted in her mom like just being very angry about it and getting released from her job and not being able to get another housekeeping position, and it made life very difficult for them. So she moves in. It's sort of half a revenge plot because she kind of wants to like show this family like that she made something of herself. But then when she encounters the father and the son of that family, she realizes that everything has kind of changed, and so she has to work out with herself and with them like all of these things that have been in her heart for so many years. And it's cute. It's a typical Lauren Lane story where like you know that there's a good reason that these characters are sort of antagonistic towards each other. Or, well, I should say that Naomi is antagonistic towards Oliver, who is the son. It makes sense, and I love that it was set in New York. I thought that the friendship, too, between the three women was also pretty fun to read about. And I just like the idea of, like, them being next door neighbors in a building, and like they have to interact with each other even when they don't particularly like each other. And I like that Naomi's sort of forced to confront the fact that maybe she's the one who needs to let go of the thing that happened in the past because she can't control the other person. She can only control her own reaction. Typical Lauren Lane though too. It does wind up to a point where there is quite a bit of drama that keeps them apart. But like any good romance, we do get a happily ever after. I live for those. So that was pretty cute and enjoyable. I wouldn't say it's my new favorite Lauren Lane book. I still think Blurred Lines is her best work that I've read so far, but it's definitely enjoyable. The next book I read is actually quite a sad one. It's gonna go the complete opposite of the tone of this one, and it's called How to Be Luminous by Harriet Ruder Hapgood. Now here's the thing about me that I didn't realize until maybe like late last year, but I have this thing about reading stories about grief because I think it's always fascinating to see different perspectives on how different sorts of people would handle grief and anger and sorrow. I find it really fascinating, and sometimes it works out really well and it feels really realistic. Other times it feels a little too contrived. And in this case, I think Harriet Ruder Hapgood did a really good job with conveying this story about grief and anger and making peace with circumstances that you can't control. And so it's about Minnie Slowe and her two sisters, and they are just trying to set their world back to some semblance of rightness after their mother has disappeared. It focuses primarily on Minnie, who has realized that ever since her mother's disappeared, she's slowly found that the world is being bleached of color, and she's only starting to see in like gray, black, and white. Oh, no. And it's obviously a depiction of her state of grief and her anger at her circumstances, and things kind of unravel from there. There's a lot of other things going on. Her relationship with her sisters, who are very different. They all deal with this in very different ways, right? And they're all sort of falling apart because of it. And then she has relationship woes, and she's also trying to figure out what to do about art school, because what are you going to do if you can't see color?
That's true.
How do you you know what I mean? And it's good. It was written in a way where it felt a little bit I felt a little bit detached from the characters, which is a little harder for me sometimes to get through. But again, because I was so interested in seeing how this author was going to portray Minnie's grief and her anger and like her hurt at the fact that their mother essentially abandoned all of them, or chose to abandon all of them, it was definitely like harrowing to read that. And I also like that in between all of these chapters where the things are happening, like where Minnie is not making the greatest choices because of her grief and anger, in between you actually get a list of the colors that she's losing and what it reminds her of, and sometimes it'll be actual things, but sometimes it'll actually be feelings. And it's like both, it's such a poetic way to talk about grief. I don't know, like for me that part was really stellar and I really liked it. I will say that I will give you guys major trigger warnings because there's like mild cheating in that book. There's mentions of suicide in that book. There's a lot of uncomfortable like behavior in it, and I think for some people that may be hard to read. It was hard for me to read as well, but I think that it felt depicted in a raw and real way, and that's why ultimately that book ended up being a pretty solid read for me. So I figured I'd end it on a high note in this video. We started on a high note, we're gonna end with a high note. This is Roar by Cora Carmack. I finally read it because my friend Rachel picked it for me for February as my friend pick of the month, and I am so glad she picked it because it is so good. Ultimately, Roar is about the main character, Aurora. She is the princess and ultimately going to be queen of her kingdom, and she's supposed to be a stormling. However, unlike everyone else in her family, she has no stormling abilities, which means she can't really protect her kingdom from and her people from like the different storms that rage in this world. Enter the arranged marriage she has with the prince of another kingdom because he's more powerful and he can help protect her secret and protect her kingdom. But then Roar, one night, because she's suspicious of this prince, follows him to like the black market, and she discovers that there may be a way that she can have access to stormling power if she can hunt down storms herself and catch them. Let me just tell you, the one thing that I love the most about this story is not the story, not the characters, it's actually the world and the magic system.
The lore.
Because the idea of like using different elemental storms in the story as both like a dangerous thing but also a thing that can give you powerful like abilities is so interesting to me. You also have to be really smart about how you do it, because the way that you protect people from the storm is not just shielding. You can also make a storm dissipate by using a storm that will counter it perfectly, or like will capture it perfectly.
That's great.
Or redirect it. And it's smart. Like, I have never read anything quite like it. I've read a lot of elemental magic stories, but this is the first one where it's specifically storms, and I thought that was so interesting. And it's even more interesting because you kind of delve into the origins of the storm and like what it is that they capture when they're taking the power.
That's cool.
So fascinating, so interesting. I also really like the characters. I mean, I know I said like that was not the biggest draw for me. I love them too. I think Roar is a great main character. She is determined to do right by her kingdom, but she also wants to be able to stand on her own 2 feet and not rely on anyone to do it for her. And so the fact that she goes off on this journey to figure out for herself if she can manage this is a very like strong selling point for me. And there are 2 boys in this book, both great. Cannot wait to find out more about them. Story-wise, it was also pretty fun because you also get this whole like journey thing where she joins this group of storm hunters basically and has to learn how to work with storms or capture storms, and that was great. But I will say there are a lot of tropes in here that are very fanfiction-y. There's a lot of dialogue that is very fanfiction-y and a lot of moments that are that way.
But isn't that what we live for?
I love fanfiction, so for me, like, I was just like rolling with all this.
Bring it on.
I mean, I would just essentially tell Macky sometimes where I was like, you know what happened just now? This is literally the thing out of fanfic. And it really is. And there's nothing wrong with that in my opinion. I think it just made it more fun for me.
Absolutely.
There is a very strong romance angle in this one though, so if that is not something that you really want to see focused on in your stories, then maybe it won't be for you, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Very much looking forward to the sequel, which is finally supposed to come out this year, which is very exciting. And it's called Rage. For good reason, which you will only find out when you read this book. Oh my god, I want to say it so badly, but it's such a spoiler.
No spoilers.
It was very good. It was very entertaining. Cannot wait for the sequel, so ending this video on a high note. Alright, those are all the books we're going to be talking about in this particular video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've read any of these books, or if you want to read any of these books, do tell us down below. And if you have any recommendations for Macky when it comes to YA fantasy that I cannot already give him based on what's
along
on my
the
shelves,
lines of Lee Bardugo and that kind of like very well
you should let him know as well.
Yeah, happy to dip my toes in that.
Anyway, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more of our videos, you can subscribe to the channel. We upload every single Friday, or we've been trying to anyway. We're doing pretty good this year. And if there are any other videos you want to see from us, for example, if you want to see, I don't know, recommendations, anything like that, feel free to let us know in the comments. I mean, we're always happy to oblige when we can. We want to know what you guys are interested in.
Right.
Just so that we can upload things that you guys will want to watch. So
absolutely.
Let us know, and we'll see you guys for another video soon. Bye!
Bye.